Good afternoon. It's good to have you here at St. Peter's for this Ecumenical Symposium as we turn now to this panel that many of us have been looking forward to, titled Church, Ministry, and Eucharist, Another Joint Declaration, ? We have a series of questions for our distinguished panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. But I just want to alert you that in your folders if you haven't found it, there's a printing of the joint statement issued by the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, issued on the 31st of October 2017, the very day of the 500th anniversary. And this really is the inspiration for this panel. One of the things that we've been talking about all day long is how this work is not simply something that happens in the academy or in international dialogues, but in local context and regional context as well. And so we thought it was really very important that if the churches are going to, as they say in this joint statement, prayerfully discern an understanding, a common understanding on church, Eucharist, and ministry, and to seek a substantial consensus so as to overcome remaining differences between us, we thought it would be important that we contribute to that conversation. So I'm grateful in that spirit you are all here with us, and I am most grateful for our distinguished panelists who I'd like to introduce to you now. Beginning at the far end, Dr. Kathryn Kleinhans, recently appointed Dean of Trinity Seminary. Kleinhans held a distinguished chair in Lutheran Heritage and Mission at Wartburg College, where she was the first woman teaching full-time in religion at that school. Her work is in Christian theology and in church history, with an emphasis on the theology and history of the Reformation. She holds degrees from Valparaiso University, Christ Seminary Seminex, the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, and Emory University. Welcome, Professor Kleinhans. To her left, I'm going to make certain that I have my, as you're looking at her to the right, it is a new friend. I've come to learn through a mutual acquaintance, and it's a delight to have Dr. Dale Coulter with us. He is Associate Professor of Historical Theology at Regent University School of Divinity. He's on the Ecumenical Board of a number of scholarly journals, and especially has served as co-editor of the Journal for the Society of Pentecostal Studies. He is the current president of the Society for Pentecostal Studies and a member of Evangelicals and Catholics Together. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Oxford University. Welcome to St. Peter's. To Dr. Coulter's left is Professor Dr. John Baldovin, a member of the Society of Jesus. Professor Baldovin is Professor of Historical and Liturgical Theology at the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. His areas of academic research include history and theology of liturgy, sacramental theology, and the history of Christian doctrine. His publications include material on the urban character of Christian worship and reforms of the sacred liturgy following the Second Vatican Council. Professor Baldwin is protege of Professor George Lindbeck, who we will remember in just a few moments. And Professor Lindbeck, among his many achievements, served for the Lutherans as one of two official Lutheran observers to the Council. Professor Baldovin holds the bachelor degree, a Master of Divinity degree, a Master of Arts degree, a Master of Philosophy degree, a Master in Sacred Literature degree, and a PhD degree, all from Yale University. It's a delight to have another Yaley in the room. You heard this morning from Professor Dr. Theodor Dieter. In 2017, Pope Francis bestowed the Ratzinger Prize on Professor Dieter in recognition of his contribution toward the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification signed by the Lutheran World Federation and the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church in 1999. A research professor at the Institute for Ecumenical Research since 1994, Professor Dieter has been its director since 1997. He is a noted scholar of methodology and hermeneutics of ecumenical dialogue and the theology of Martin Luther and its medieval background and modern relevance. I know no one who knows Martin Luther as well as Professor Dieter. He is a pastor in the EKD and holds degrees from Heidelberg and Tübingen. It's a delight to have you in New York City. Monsignor John Radano is to Professor Dieter's left. Professor Radano teaches at Seton Hall University and for many years served as a member of the staff of the Pontifical Council for promoting Christian unity, eventually becoming the head of its Western division. And his accomplishments and work in ecumenism are vast, particularly in shepherding the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification through the complicated process that ultimately led to the signing in Augsburg in 1999. He is a good friend of St. Peter's and always glad to have you here. Our final panelist is Professor Dr. William Rush. Professor Rush is Professor of Lutheran Studies at Yale University and an internationally regarded ecumenist who has served in local, regional, national, and international church contexts for more than 50 years. He is widely published in the areas of ecumenism and then also in the area of his initial and earliest research, patristics. Professor Rush holds degrees from Oxford University, where he is also a fellow, the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, and the State University of New York at Buffalo. And a special word of thanks to him for helping in a very intense way to set up this entire day, but particularly this panel. Thank you. Before we turn to the content of our panel, as I noted in the introductions, and that many of you have probably learned, Professor Lindbeck, George Lindbeck, died earlier in January, and it is only really becoming known in the ecumenical community over the course of the last couple of days. We were able to actually confirm that earlier this week, and Yale sent out a formal announcement on Friday. Before we begin this work, it seemed appropriate to have a moment to remember this giant of the faith and giant of the ecumenical movement. Indeed, not a single person in this room would be sitting in this room if it were not for George Lindbeck and pioneering leaders like him. So I thought what we would do to do that is to begin with Professor Kleinhans, and if every person on the panel would just say a word about Professor Lindbeck's influence in their life. We'll conclude with Professor Rush, who will give a slightly more full biography, and then our bishop will lead us in prayer. I should say there are microphones on the table.
Thank you. Two memories. One, I was mentioning this at lunchtime conversation. I remember being part of conversation early in the life of the ELCA as we were discussing various forms of ministry, both clergy and lay, in which George Lindbeck, as a lay theologian, well-established and well-respected, was reflecting on whether or not he should become an associate in ministry, which was one of the lay rosters earlier in the life of the ELCA, and said, you know, there's nothing in it I need, except that I think it would be good for me to be accountable to the church, and I think the church should want me to be accountable to it. The other thing I'll say is that I started graduate school at Emory in the fall of 1985, shortly after the publication of Lindbeck's The Nature of Doctrine, and that has been a very formative influence in my own thinking about doing theology within the midst of ecclesial communities.
Well, I didn't know, obviously, George Lindbeck personally, but the significance for Pentecostals in particular is, I think, this. Pentecostals live between two worlds, the evangelical world to its right and the mainline world to the left, and it's been very difficult at times in the evangelical world. The mainline world has actually been the better partner, to be quite honest, the more open partner. Lindbeck's theology, in fact the Yale school that Lindbeck was part of, Hans Frey and all of that, the theological work that they did actually gave Pentecostals at a time that they needed it, a theological voice that allowed them to begin to differentiate themselves theologically from others who sought to define them. And so it's that generosity of spirit that Lindbeck exhibited in wanting others to find their theological voice and in doing theology that actually enabled them to do so. The narrative theology, all of that I think significantly impacted them and allows Pentecostals like our chief ecumenist, Mel Robeck, who everyone up here probably knows, many of you may know him, to say, we're not evangelicals, which Mel says quite often and quite forcefully. So I think that's the significance of Lindbeck for us as a movement.
I first met George Lindbeck when I was a young Jesuit in 1971. I took his course on comparative doctrine in the summer school at St. John's in Collegeville, Minnesota. And we took to each other, I'd have to say. And he was very instrumental in getting me to go to Yale for my PhD. There I took 3 more courses from him. I probably learned more about Protestant, Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican sacramental theology from Lindbeck than from anybody else. I was happy to be in the systematic theology seminar with David Kelsey and Hans Frey and George when George presented the material that became The Nature of Doctrine. And I was also very privileged to be able to host him when we gave him a doctorate, honorary doctorate, out in Berkeley in the mid-1990s at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley. The last thing I would say is, I think the finest thing I could say about anyone, he was a fine Christian gentleman.
I have not met George Lindbeck in person, but what I learned about him was that the Institute had, so to speak, a proto-institute before it was founded in 1965 in Strasbourg, and this institute was located at that time in Copenhagen, Denmark, and Lindbeck was the first research professor of our institute, so to speak, of the proto-institute. And so we are very grateful and have a good memory of him, not only on this reason, but this is a special relation of him to our institute.
I met George Lindbeck when he came to Rome to teach at the Gregorian University. I remember going one night when he gave a lecture, and we had some discussion about some of the things he said. But I owe him a debt of gratitude in that it was mentioned that I was a kind of a shepherd of the joint declaration. Well, that's not really true. I was kind of involved in different parts of it. He's a shepherd. Theo is one of the shepherds of the joint declaration. But I did write a book about it. I wrote a book in which I traced the relationship of the Lutheran World Federation and the Catholic Church from Vatican II up to the signing of the joint declaration. And George Lindbeck was kind enough to read the manuscript, and he encouraged me in writing it. I'm very grateful to him for that.
You went personal before the... Well, I was never actually a student of George Lindbeck's, although we interacted at several places in the course of his lifetime and mine, and two come to particular attention. When I was appointed to the United States Lutheran-Roman Catholic Dialogue, and I'm still not sure why that neophyte was appointed to that dialogue, two people took special interest in me, which I will never forget, and that was George Lindbeck and Arthur Karl Piepkorn. And whatever I've learned since, I owe a debt to both of them. And the other contact with George was when I was approached. I had not applied or anything. I was approached, would I teach at Yale Divinity School and join the faculty? David Bartlett called me. That name probably only means something to a few people here. And I debated whether I should do that. One of the people I called was George. And I asked George, do you think I should take this appointment? And he was very encouraging that I should. And I would say to Pastor Durr, that may have affected St. Peter's, sir.
Just a little.
So George has very, very special memories for me. But to speak in a more official kind of way, George Lindbeck was the son of missionary parents. He was born in China, and sometime in the dialogue we would say, if we could only put it into Mandarin first, we might understand what George was trying to tell us. George was very much a product of those 17 or 18 years when he was brought up in China on the mission field. He went to Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota, and then went to New Haven and Yale. And friends, beware, he never left. He did a BD, which was what was done in those days, went on and did an MA and a PhD, and then, quite unusual, stayed on in a junior faculty position as instructor, then assistant professor. And as the news release indicates from Yale very accurately, in those days, one did that, and then it was expected you'd get a job elsewhere. Yale had helped you along. But associate and full professor, those appointments were made from people outside of Yale who would be invited to such prestigious positions. But as our dean, Craig, said, George made the great leap from assistant professor to associate professor and then professor, and spent his entire career at Yale. I think Nature of Doctrine and some of the things he wrote on infallibility are particularly important. We do not have his major work on ecclesiology because he spent years working on Professor Calhoun's lectures and seeing that those would be published. But it's hard to imagine the Lutheran-Roman Catholic relationship of today without George Lindbeck and what he did. A layman out of the Augustana tradition, deeply committed. There are many stories about George, and probably most of them are apocryphal. And I'm going to share just one, and I do it with all due respect. I wonder in some ways if it was kind of a foretaste of what would come in George's life. But there's a story that a doctoral student from Yale went to the Lindbeck residence and rang the doorbell, and George came to the door, and Mr. Jones, come in. And typically George, in his quiet way, sat this student down and said, just a moment, I'm going to brew some tea. Remember China. And George made the tea and came in, and he said, now how is the dissertation going? And engaged in conversation. The student began to get more and more nervous and kept looking at his watch. And then he finally decided he just had to be disrespectful. He said, Professor Lindbeck, do you know why I'm here? The student said, the dean's office has sent me. I am to take you to New York to the airport. You're going to some council or something that's going to open in Rome in 2 days. She says, oh, that is so correct. And that was George Lindbeck. So I hope that gives you a little flavor of the person and his enormous contribution. Sure.
We turn now to our panel discussion, Church, Ministry, and Eucharist, another joint declaration, question mark. And all of the panelists have received these questions in advance. We wanted to take this panel in as efficient and serious a way as possible, knowing that this topic is vast, and we couldn't solve all the church's problems today, but we could take a stab at a few areas. First question is for Professor Rush. On October 31st of 2017, the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity issued a joint communique setting the prayerful goal of articulating a substantial consensus in the areas of church, ministry, and Eucharist. Perhaps this consensus could take a form similar to the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. Before we delve into the specific areas of consensus or any remaining difference, I'd like us first to explore this question of form. What are the meaningful components such a declaration ought have in order for it to have real impact in the life of the churches? Monsignor Radano, there's a microphone to your right.
Well, I would say the short answer to that question is that we are now at a great advantage. We have the experience of the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. When that was first proposed in the early 1990s, it was inviting the churches into areas that they had not entered before. How does one enter into the kind of reception of this type of document, which was, after all, a new type of document to be proposed? And so, if we're on the verge of another joint declaration, I think there are learnings there that we would be very foolish not to accept. And namely, it's the concept of differentiated or differentiating consensus, where we're able on one level, let's say level A, to say there is a fundamental consensus on a particular topic. And then to recognize level B, where there are continuing differences. And we do not need to resolve all of those differences if they do not challenge the consensus on level A. So I would say a lesson we should take from this, as this process hopefully begins, is on church, ministry, and Eucharist, we do not have to solve all the outstanding issues between us to see significant progress.
Might ask a follow-up question. The joint declaration on the doctrine of justification dealt with a very particular theological disagreement rooted in the experience of Lutherans and Roman Catholics from the 16th century. These areas, church, ministry, and Eucharist, is there a difference between the nature of a joint declaration on justification as a topic and a joint declaration on church, ministry, and Eucharist, particularly with view to how it will have real impact in the life of the church?
It's an important question, and I think you've already somewhat answered it in the remarks that you have made. Certainly from the Lutheran perspective, we had to do justification first. I mean, that's the article on which the church stands or falls for us. But let's admit, in the late 20th century and early 21st century, for many Christians, that's a very abstract teaching that they have difficulty seeing where it impacts their life. If we're successful with this proposal of a new declaration, I think the immediate relevancy of it to life in parishes could be considerable. That we're able to agree about aspects of church, about ministry among us and between us, and about the sacrament of the altar. So I think the immediate and popular impact will be greater.
Thank you. Any of the panelists wish to add or comment? We move to a question for Monsignor Radano. For many years you were head of the Western Division, as I said in the introduction, of the Pontifical Council for promoting Christian unity. If Professor Dieter shepherded the joint declaration, you certainly worked intensely on that, giving official and juridical status to the substantial consensus of the theological work that had been taken up by the dialogues for many, many years, and applying the ecumenical methodology of differentiated or differentiating consensus. I'm curious, what was the Roman Catholic Church, and for that matter, the Lutheran side, looking for in the joint declaration that could be helpful in a joint declaration on the topics of church, ministry, and Eucharist? Another way to say the question is, what was learned in the process of the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification that could be helpful in this potential initiative?
Well, from the point of view of the Roman Catholic Church, the process that we have involves the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And so, for example, with the joint declaration, the Pontifical Council for Unity worked with the Lutheran World Federation to bring it to its best form. And but part of the process involved the examination of it by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And that's a good thing in the sense that the congregation is looking to ensure that the faith of the Catholic Church is upheld. But I think the problem there is that the theologians working for the congregation do not have the experience of dialogue that we had in the Pontifical Council. Some of the things that are said in the joint declaration or any other ecumenical document come through dialogue. You have to experience it. You deal with issues in dialogue and solve certain questions. If you're not in that dialogue, you don't always understand how your church, in this case the Catholic Church, can say such and such a thing. And that's part of, so we're always, we're very much aware that we have the congregation which will look at the text and evaluate it on the basis of Catholic faith. Now that leads me to, I'd like to say one other thing about this process, about the three items of church, ministry, and Eucharist. Back in 1989, when the Lutheran World Federation and the Catholic Church began to look seriously at response and reception of the reports of dialogue, which hadn't been done before, the first thing they did was to set up a committee of staff people, and that included, on the Lutheran side, Harding Meyer and Jean Brand, former member of this very church, and on the Catholic side, Eloise Klein and myself. And we had to work out what was called strategies for reception. How do we go about reception of these issues? And it's interesting that that statement suggested that the documents to be submitted for reception were the one on ecclesiology, which would only be finished in 1993. Secondly, what was called the platform statement on justification. Thirdly, the Eucharist from 1978. And fourthly, the ministry, 1981. And it was said that these together form, quote, a conceptual whole. They all relate to each other. And so it was proposing to the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council that reception could begin on these together. And that, as it turned out, as you know, it was decided to focus on justification and not do the other. And I think that was wise, because if all those others were somehow involved in a process of reception, I'm not sure that we could have gotten to where we did with the joint declaration on justification. All those others, because there are a lot of differences built into them between us, as well as the great amount of convergence and agreement we have. And so when I hear today about a step towards a joint statement on 3 issues, church, ministry, and Eucharist, it raises the question in my mind as to whether that might be too much. Is it better to focus on one of these first, or can we do the 3 together? And when you look at both the agreements and some of the things still to be done on these 3 areas, it's a challenging question. And so it's just a question that I raise as to a strategy we might have, because it's urgent that we go ahead with these issues, whether we take them all 3 at once or one at a time, let's say starting with the church or starting with ministry. I don't know, but that's one of the questions that I would raise from the perspective of the process that I know that our church will go through.
Thank you. We'll ask Professor Theodor later on maybe to flag that and respond in the question I have for you in a little bit. Before we move on and explore some of these areas, I wonder, Professor Rush and Monsignor Radano, if I could simply ask you too, knowing the long arc of the work of the international and several national dialogues in such close detail, is there a substantial consensus with regard to church, with regard to ministry, with regard to Eucharist? Could you give us 1 or 2 examples in each area where consensus exists and that would have, I keep going back to this phrase, real impact, important impact in the life of the church?
Well, the short answer to your question is yes.
You can take a little longer.
Thank you. I would point to the dialogue report, Church and Justification, the statement on Eucharist from the International Dialogue, and there's a very fascinating, at least to me, recent report, I'm not sure how well it's known, from the Finnish Lutheran Roman Catholic Dialogue, and the text reads well, but whatever, well, this is video or something.
This is video.
Whichever Finn picked the title, that was an unfortunate choice. Sorry. Because the choice of the title is Communion in Growth. And I'm not sure what that means. But the dialogue report itself on all 3 of these topics captures consensus from earlier dialogue reports, in some ways moves them along. So the short answer is there is material there to be mined.
I agree with that, and I think this new document from Finland is very interesting, and it goes into depth in some issues, like, for example, on the papacy. It goes into the history of the bad times, the time when the papacy and the papal states and so forth, and the intertwining of church and politics and all of that we had to get beyond. I think one of the great things that happened in 1870 in the revolution in Italy was that the papal states were taken away, and so that left the papacy in a very small, it left it free so that now it can be more of an evangelical office. It can be a place to evangelize and to the question of the koinonia of the church on every level. And but I think there's been a great deal of consensus. I think that some of the convergent convergence pointed to in this Finnish statement when it speaks about the question of ordination. Is it a sacrament? For the Catholics, it's a sacrament. And for the Finns, the Finnish Lutherans, they say that they speak of it more as sacramental, although they say in certain conditions it can be called a sacrament, they say. And so I'm thinking always of from our point of view of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, wanting to uphold Catholic faith about 7 sacraments, including ordination as a sacrament, would look very closely at that and see whether that convergence that has been found in that document is enough. Is it enough to protect the faith of the Catholic Church? I mean, that's part of the what goes on in those efforts. So yes, there's a great deal there, but I think there's still significant issues that are pointed to in the Finnish document and also in the American document, issues that still need to be dealt with or clarified.
Thank you. We'll turn to Professor Kleinhans. The reformers of the 16th century were concerned that the church had, in a way you could describe it this way, that the church had failed the pastoral needs of its people. The rigors of the medieval penitential system, with its indulgences and all, still left people wondering whether or not they were right with God. Far from seeking something less than church, one could say the reformers wanted the church of their day to be more church. The very fervency of the reformers seems to suggest that the church's essential role in evangelization, worship, service to the neighbor, and care of creation, I think. So my question, how do Lutherans and Roman Catholics articulate this essential characteristic of the church anew together? And concretely, to borrow Pope Francis and Bishop Yunan's word from their joint statement at Lund Cathedral in 2016, how can we express and articulate this essential characteristic of the church anew together for the sake of the visible unity of the church?
You asked for concrete, so I'll start with an image. Some of us in the room doubtless remember the days of using a dipstick to check the oil in your car. You pull it out, you wipe it clean, you put it back in, you take it out, and you look at it. And you look at it for 2 reasons. You're looking to see, first of all, is there enough oil, or are you running a quart low? But you're looking also to see the cleanliness or the clarity of the oil. There might be enough, but maybe it's all gunked up, in which case it's not running so clearly. That double-sided dipstick image is one that I was taught to use in terms of focusing on the central theology of the Lutheran reformers. Through Luther's writings, and particularly throughout the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, there's a twin concern expressed, both for the necessity of Jesus Christ crucified and risen as the core of theology, and also, as you began your question with, for meeting the pastoral needs of the people. The clarity of the gospel. Is the oil clear or gunked up? Is one of the things that the Lutheran reformers checked for. And the other was the question of, is it enough? And particularly, is it enough to meet the pastoral needs of the people? Do they actually feel the gospel? Does it make a difference in their lives? I think those 2 concerns work for us anew today in our ecumenical conversations. So it's not about who wrote which confession or which formulation, but to say together, is the gospel of Jesus Christ crucified and risen the clear center of our work? And are the people who need it receiving it? In terms of some of the particular things you asked about, I think that the list of the church's role in worship and evangelization, in service of neighbor and care of creation, I think that really fits in the same model with the proclamation of the gospel in worship and in witness, both to those inside and outside the church. Those are expressions of that theological end of the dipstick. How do we preach the word clearly? And I think the concerns that we articulate for service of neighbor, and particularly in recent generations for care of creation, are really extensions of that practical end of the dipstick. Is the world getting what it needs from our witness and proclamation? One other piece of language that I think is particularly helpful as we work together to live out both that central core of witness to Christ and its expression in service of neighbor and care of creation is the concept of vocation. We're used to talking about how Luther expanded the notion of vocation beyond professional work, or beyond professional church work, to include any work done for the good of neighbor. But we still too often, I think, tend to use that language in an individualistic way, when for Luther the concept of vocation was very much set in communities. Not only in the sense that your individual work is called to serve the neighbor, but that one of the callings that you have is the calling to community. The community of your family, your religious community, and civil society as well. And one of the beauties of Luther's articulating, particularly of the call to civil society, is that it's not something that's dependent on religious identity. It's not a particularly Lutheran call. It's not even a particularly Christian call. For Luther, that call to work together in service of neighbor and for the good of creation is something that God has built into the very fabric of creation. It's something to which all human beings are called. And so I think in that concrete work for justice, justice for the neighbor, eco-justice, we have a place to begin and continue conversations which then can lead us together more richly to articulate the theology and the faith that inspires us.
Thank you. That reminder of how broad vocation is for Luther is helpful for us, and I think also to point to one of the themes that we've had throughout this entire day. It's all of our vocation. It's imbued in us by God to embody the unity of the church. That's a gift from God, and so that's a helpful reminder. Thank you. This question for Professor Dieter. Lutherans have had for nearly the entirety of the past 500 years a plurality of practice with regard to ordained ministry. In some places, for example, the episcopate was maintained, and in other places it was not possible to maintain the episcopate. And yet Lutherans have continued to follow the biblical witness that ordination is transmitted by the laying on of hands and prayer as an unrepeatable action. Similarly, Lutherans have put into practice the priesthood of all believers, and yet have always maintained that the priesthood of all the baptized enriches the ordained ministry. In this way, and in their own plurality of practice, Lutherans have held the ordained ministry to serve the unity of the church. In what ways, methodologies, concepts, in what ways could Lutherans and Roman Catholics view and honor this history and experience not as a hindrance, but as a gift from God for unity? Could Lutherans and Roman Catholics, for example, say together that by the power of the Holy Spirit, ordained ministry, perhaps even with differentiated or differentiating practice, contributes to the ongoing apostolic faithfulness to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? And if so, what substantial difference, we'll go back to this question always, could such an acknowledgement make in the missionary life of the churches?
Well, when it comes to the question of ministry, I think we should be aware that there is an asymmetrical situation. So I think no Protestant theologian would not recognize the Catholic ministry, while this is not the case on the other way. So to a certain degree, I'm the wrong person to answer the question, because I think it is basically now a question for our Catholic colleagues to say what would be the conditions for their side to appreciate the Lutheran ministry in the way that is described in the question. And I can here only mention a few attempts to answer the question. The first is when the Second Vatican Council identified certain elements of sanctification and truth outside the Roman Catholic Church, then already in the commentaries on the documents of the Second Vatican Council in the Lexicon für Theologie und Kirche, it was observed that if something like faith and love and hope and spiritual life is outside the Catholic Church, then according to Catholic standards this is not possible without any kind of ministry. So the mere fact of this life implies, according to Catholic presuppositions, an acknowledgement of something like a ministry. Otherwise it would not make sense to speak about the ecclesial communities, not only about communities. And since it is also said that the Holy Spirit uses these communities as means of salvation, so there is a certain way of acknowledgement of the ministry implied. But the problem is then to make this implication explicit, and this has not happened so far. In the document on the apostolicity of the Church, we have made the argument that the fact that the joint declaration, nearly after 500 years after the Reformation, acknowledges a consensus in basic truths of the doctrine of justification, is a sign that the Lutheran ministry helped to keep the Lutheran churches in the truth to the apostolic heritage. And that means that the ministry has fulfilled the tasks that a ministry has to do. So this is again an argument from the consequences to what the ministry is in itself. And then one could go further if I think of the encyclical letter of Pope Francis, The Joy of the Gospel. The Pope focuses very much on evangelization, and he looks for allies who do evangelization, and he sees these allies in many different churches. And so if the focus is on the work that is done, then I think we would have possibilities to recognize mutually the work of each other without focusing so much on the question what the ministry is in itself. But in my eyes, this requires a deliberate reflection and a dialogue what the perspectives are under which we regard the ministry. The dialogues may have identified many commonalities, but the question is, and I think this is a question to the Catholic side, which elements of the visible unity are necessary that we can speak of unity. So Catholics quite often use or emphasize, and Lutherans too, the goal of ecumenism is visible unity, but it is not really clear what this visibility includes. And as long as there may be different standards of visibility, we can have many agreements, and nevertheless this would not be a substantial agreement so that we, for example, can celebrate the Lord's Supper together. So I think we have to clarify some questions, and in my eyes especially the concept of visible unity. Which elements of visibility are seen from both sides as required in order to be able to speak of communion or of unity.
Thank you. So two follow-up questions that perhaps our Roman Catholic friends could address. You raised one question about this, the question of parity with regard to ministry and what that might look like. And then the second question, which is what are the elements of visible unity? And I wonder if Monsignor Radano or Professor Baldovin would speak a word or two to that.
I could do
Say
that.
I can say a word. And
Sure, go ahead.
We usually, for example, in the encyclical Unum Sint, addresses this question and says that the three areas that we look for in order to achieve visible unity are, first of all, a common understanding of the apostolic faith. Secondly, a common understanding of the sacraments. And thirdly, a common understanding of the hierarchical ministry of the church. It's usually put that way. And so, for example, on the question of sacraments, in our dialogue, we've done a great deal on that. But I think the two statements that we have, one from Finland and one from the United States, also point to certain issues that need further clarification before we can say that we have a common understanding in the full sense of the sacraments or the ministry. Certain things are still to be discussed and to understood in that way. So I think the dialogue is actually trying to face those issues, and the dialogue in pointing out the great deal that we have in agreement or convergence, and it outlines that. All these dialogues do. And also issues that still need further discussion. I mean, these are the things that hold us back from a full picture of a common understanding in these three areas. So I'll just mention that for starts.
Maybe add a question. The three areas that you mentioned, Jack, are the classical three connections or binds that Bellarmine raised. And if you fully follow the Bellarmine concept, then this is return ecumenism. And for me, the challenging question to the Catholic side would be, what is, you don't want return ecumenism. That is clear. But you want visible unity. And my question is, what are the elements of this visibility? And the problem is that the dialogue cannot really answer this question, because we can say we have here and here and here and here an agreement, but then the Catholic side can say, but you need here and here and here an agreement. And before we meaningfully can speak about really a substantial agreement, we need to address the question which requirements are necessary, and then we can say these questions are not yet solved. But I'm a little bit hesitant now always to continue to have one agreement after the other without knowing when the fullness of the agreements is finally reached. I would now like to know this before we continue the dialogue.
That's a very good question. Well above my pay grade, but I agree with you. One of the problems is on the question of recognizing ministry. It is a one-way street. It's clearly a one-way street. It's exemplified in the fact that others, members of what we call ecclesial communions, are, under certain circumstances, welcome to receive Holy Communion in the Roman Catholic Church, whereas Roman Catholics are quite clearly forbidden to receive communion in churches which do not share in, and this is the sticking point, isn't it, the apostolic succession. And I think theologians are way ahead of the magisterium in the Catholic Church on this issue for years, almost immediately after the council. For example, people like Hans Kuhn were talking about how we need to understand apostolic succession within the umbrella of apostolic faith or apostolic tradition. And those elements that Msgr. Radano was mentioning are all aspects of that. One thing that's quite clear in terms of the apostolic faith, and that we sometimes neglect, I think, is obviously the scriptures. And another is baptism, which has not been mentioned here. It's interesting, we talk about church, ministry, and Eucharist, but that classic statement from the World Council of Churches, Faith and Order, was called Baptism, Eucharist, Ministry. And many of us who are, at least on the liturgical side of our work, want to insist that unless you begin with a baptismal ecclesiology, you're never going to get anywhere. And I think that might be kind of a starting point to answer your question. But I think your question is very well put. You know, will we keep, as we say in American football, will we keep moving the goalpost every time there's an agreement? The hardest part is the question of ministry that you were addressing. If you look at the Roman Catholic response to the Lima document, you know, there's a 6-volume set of responses to the Lima document. Turian, I guess, was the editor of it. And the Roman Catholic response is strongest on the question of ministry and authority. And just one last thought on this, because I'm going on. It's also necessary, however, not to do return ecclesiology, but to understand historical theology and the context in which someone like Luther could think that, which was a reasonable context in terms of medieval theology, could think that presbyters could ordain other presbyters. That issue was not clarified completely in the Roman Church until Vatican II, with its insistence on the fact that the episcopacy, the episcopate, is a separate order. In some ways, that puts a spanner in the wheel for ecumenical dialogue. It's very interesting what the council did with episcopacy, because in some ways it moved us further away from the ecumenical consensus.
As you can see, when we start to probe these topics that are very, very rich, and we're thankful for all of you because you know these topics so very well, helps us to understand what really are many of the dynamics at work when we say, well, let's have a declaration on ministry. Professor Baldovin, I wonder if we might turn to the question of Eucharist. And the question is very, very simple. In light of, after Vatican II, and in light of the dialogues, could Lutherans and Roman Catholics say together that Jesus Christ is truly and substantially present in the Lord's Supper? Could we say together that there is a sacramental participation in the body and blood of Christ? Could we say that together? And then how would you suggest we might explain to the average person who doesn't believe it would be possible for that to be said, such a consensus statement could be made, and what it would make in the difference in the life of the churches?
The last part of your question is a question that, the kind of question I try to pose to my Master of Divinity students.
They should watch because they'll get the answer.
To see if they could answer it adequately. But it's a very good question. First of all, not only could we say that, we have said it, basically. I think all of the dialogues have basically affirmed our agreement in the true substantial presence of the Lord in the Eucharist. I don't think that's in the least bit problematic. Those who were in the seminar that I gave today, I'll repeat the conclusions of Karl Rahner, the great Jesuit German Catholic theologian, who in '64 he wrote an article on the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, basically with a view towards how can we reconcile Roman Catholic and Lutheran understanding. And he said something that is very clearly, of course I'm putting 30 pages into 2 sentences, but he said, transubstantiation cannot tell us anything, and that's usually the sticking point. Transubstantiation cannot tell us anything that this is my body and this is my blood. Do not tell us. Which is, and I think that's true, because transubstantiation is merely a manner of speaking. And after all, Trent, the Council of Trent, said only condemned people who said you can't use the word. So there is some wiggle room there. They were not as dumb as we might think. The Council of Trent was very careful in its formulations. I would begin by going to the Scriptures, of course, which we have in common, and trying to explain how we and the Roman Catholics and the Lutheran tradition have both affirmed this right from the beginning. I still remember clearly Professor George Lindbeck saying to us that he thought that Luther had an even more objective understanding of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist than many Roman Catholics did or do. And I think reading Luther, I think I could agree with him that he was correct on that issue. So much goes back to. And the other aspect is, of course, the liturgy itself. My friend and former colleague, the Methodist liturgical scholar James White, once said in a speech, "Why teach ecumenism when you can teach liturgy?" And I think that's true. You know, if many Roman Catholics anyway came here to St. Peter's Lutheran for a Sunday Eucharist, they would find precious little that differentiated it from their experience anyway, their experience of a Roman Catholic liturgy. And I dare say that would be true in any number of Lutheran churches, Episcopal churches, even some Methodist churches. You would find the celebration of the Eucharist, they would scratch their heads as to say, why is it that we cannot receive in one another's church? I think maybe we're starting to move in a better direction here. Pope Francis famously said to some people, apparently a Lutheran-Roman Catholic couple in Rome, when they asked him about receiving communion, I think he put the ball into their own court by saying, well, this is something you have to figure out. And I think this is a new dawn for many people religiously to realize that discernment, it's a good Jesuit word, discernment is something that the good Christian in good conscience can do, not only on this issue, but on so many issues. I run the risk of going on and on, so I'll be quiet.
Thank you. We have about 7 minutes remaining. I have 2 more questions, but Monsignor Radano wanted to say something, I think?
Yes, just to, personally, I don't think that the goalposts are being pushed out further and further. I think we have to remember that we just had an anniversary, 500 years, commemoration, 500 years from the time of the Reformation. And I often wonder if we know how that 500 years affected us. That meant for 500 years we had deep misunderstandings of each other, lack of knowledge of the way each other works on things, and all of that is still in play now. And so we see things very differently, and we're coming to try to see them in a common way, but that's going to take some time.
So we have just a few minutes remaining. Professor Rush needs to also catch a train. So I'm going to turn to Professor Coulter, and we all need to go pray. I was trying to think about how to ask this question, and I thought I would begin by trying to, and this seems almost impossible, but it seems fair at least to characterize Pope Francis's ecumenical heart as being deeply related to his pastoral heart. He is through and through Roman Catholic, yet at the same time seems to be willing to reach across traditional lines like few before him. I think we've touched a little bit of this on the panel. Certainly his approach is different in character, but not in substance, I think, from Benedict XVI, John Paul II, or John the 23rd. He has deep ties with the evangelical and Pentecostal movements. So I'm wondering, what promise is there in a conversation between Catholics and evangelicals and Pentecostals? What promise is there between Lutherans and evangelicals and Pentecostals? And what promise is there in them working together? And particularly with this topic of a potential joint declaration on church ministry and Eucharist, I wonder how a project undertaken by Lutherans and Roman Catholics could be influenced by and also influence Pentecostal or evangelical movement.
Right.
Okay, yeah, there you go.
Let me just set aside the whole evangelical thing for a second, because that's another ball of wax, another world. I can tell you what Francis has done for the Pentecostal world that other popes didn't do, not because they didn't intend to. It just has to do with his own history. He's opened up relational links. So Msgr. Radano, what he said a few moments ago about how these dialogues live and die on relationships, forged over time through prayer, where we learn one another and we learn to trust one another. And he came into the office of the papacy with those relationships in place. And there's a wonderful picture from 2005 where Cardinal Bergoglio is on his knees and Pentecostals and Charismatics are around him, laying hands on him, including my former dean, Vincent Synon, and praying for him. There's the iPhone video that Pope Francis recorded that was then played in Kenneth Copeland's church in Oklahoma, where he greeted them. It was like shockwaves through the Pentecostal charismatic community that the Pope would do that. All of that really just is kind of relational groundwork, is what I would say. Relational groundwork to build trust. So that's, I think, what Pope Francis brings to the table that other popes haven't. That, and he just has a strong emphasis on the Catholic charismatic movement as an important movement in the new evangelization and pushing that forward. The other thing, the other question about what promise is there. You just have to remember that, so the Pentecostal Catholic dialogue has been happening since 1972. Msgr. Radano has been involved in, how many dialogues have you been involved with on that?
I think about 5.
Right, most of them, yes. There's been a tremendous amount of work. Those dialogues are running on a different track than the dialogue with Lutherans. There's not a push toward visible unity in those dialogues. They're for mutual understanding. That's the purpose of the dialogues. And really that's the purpose for all the dialogues that Pentecostals are engaged in. The dialogue with Lutherans, Reformed, Catholics, and then the conversations we're having with the Orthodox that haven't been formalized yet in any way. So the promise is mutual understanding. Now that may not seem like much to this audience, but it is considerable in the sense that mutual understanding really can change attitudes on the ground at the parish level that Pentecostals and Catholics or Pentecostals and Lutherans or Pentecostals and Reformed have to one another and how they relate to one another. And we've certainly seen the practical outworking of that with respect to the Catholic Pentecostal dialogue. The other benefit is that this mutual understanding, to use John Paul II's language, it results in an exchange of gifts. So the Catholics, I'm thinking of Killian MacDonald, who's in his 90s now, Benedictine monk, wonderful man of God. He helped Pentecostals in the early 1970s discover who they were. He's the one who comes up with the tag classical Pentecostal, which we now all use of ourselves. So it's a Catholic who gave that gift to us, a gift of self-description that we now have adopted and embody. So that's a practical impact of the way in which this exchange of gifts help us to rediscover who we are by forcing us to go back to our own sources and think about how we understand ourselves. So I'd say those are a couple of effects. Let me say one other thing here. The Lutheran Pentecostal exchange, I think, is already having some nice impact. One of the challenges of these dialogues is that for the Pentecostals, there's not a way to receive the documents. Mel Roebuck has had this problem for the whole time he's been involved. We don't have official mechanisms by which we can receive them. So how do we get them out? It's just word of mouth. It's just relationships. The Society for Pentecostal Studies, of which I'm the president, is one way of doing that. So we try to serve as a clearinghouse. Every dialogue that creates a statement, we then digest and we get it out there. One of the things we did this last year in St. Louis when we went there is the conference that I put together was the recent joint statement on charisms had been issued by the Catholic and Pentecostal. So I reached out to Concordia and said, we've got a Catholic Pentecostal session. We're going to look at this document. I'd love to hear a Missouri Synod perspective on this. I've got a friend there, Joel Olowski. So the president of Concordia was excited about the fact that we were there and reaching out to them. So we did. They sent 2 representatives from Missouri Synod. Joel was one of them. And then I got to introduce Joel to Cheryl Peterson, who is a systematician under Kit. They started to connect with one another because Missouri Synod's not involved in this international Lutheran Pentecostal dialogue. So that's another way, I think, in which these dialogues can start to gain life and start to connect us in ways that we hadn't been connected. So that's a little longer than probably I intended, but those are some ways.
That's immensely helpful, and will lead to my final question to the whole panel. We'll begin with Dr. Kleinhans and work our way down here. If substantial consensus could be articulated in an official and juridical way by Lutherans and Roman Catholics on the topic of church ministry and Eucharist, as the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council said they would prayerfully go about doing in their October 31st statement, what substantial difference would that make to your life?
I think I'll have the shortest answer. Some of you know I've been in this new call as Dean of Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University only since January 1st. So on the assumption that what difference this would make to my life really means what difference would this make in my context and to my work, I don't know yet.
Okay. Goalpost moved.
Right. I would say it would represent symbolically a significant milestone in the history of ecumenism that has really yet to materialize. That movement toward visible unity, that level of connection, in some quarters, the ecumenical movement, let's just be honest, is losing steam. So I think something like that would be, it's like applying the paddles of life to a patient that's on the table about to die. I mean, it would help to resuscitate the movement. I mean, we're right now in the Pentecostal Catholic dialogue, we've had 6 of these. And how far do you go in mutual understanding before you ask the question, should we take it to the next level? Which is, of course, a move to visible unity. I think Pentecostals are scared to death to even think about that question. But that really is somewhere, it's got to be somewhere on the horizon, right? I mean, so something like that would, I think, send a healthy shock in a good way to wake up the church that God can do things that we didn't think were possible.
Well, I guess first thing, personally, I'd say it would end up being the answer to over 50 years of prayer, because it would be a step almost completely toward mutual communion, which I think is necessary for our, not only for the fullness of our own Christian faith, but for our Christian witness throughout the world, which of course is hampered, injured by our division. So I think it would be personally so immensely satisfying. The other thing I would be able to do is say to my students, "See, I told you so."
Well, I think the answer depends on the question, what is a substantial consensus? If I take it as the word seems to indicate, then I would say the consequence would be that there church communion between the Lutheran Church and the Roman Catholic Church must be, not only can be, but must be declared, and this would be absolutely fantastic. So incredibly good. But I'm hesitant whether we will achieve such a substantial consensus in the foreseeable future.
Professor Bill Henn, who is a professor at the Gregorian University in Rome and deeply involved in ecumenism in many ways, recently wrote an article in which he, after his years of ecumenism, he outlined what he considered the strengths and weaknesses of the ecumenical movement now. And strength number one, he said, was that in every initiative in the ecumenical movement, people expressed the idea that they were trying to do God's will for the unity of the church, God's will for the unity of Christians. And I think that's a key point. I mean, we often say, what can we get out of this? That's important, and you know, there are many important things that we can. But I think we can also have the satisfaction of knowing, if we take this to the next level of substantial consensus around these issues, that we continue to do the will of Christ, who called for the unity of his disciples.
Thank you all for your insight, for your honesty, and also for your leadership and prayer. Allow us to thank you by applause.